Somewhere in your jaw, right now, a small decision is being made without your permission. A muscle fiber tightens by some infinitesimal degree. Your inner ear, without consulting you, adjusts its pressure very slightly. Your lungs prepare to draw in a breath larger than the one before it, though you have not asked them to. If you are lying still, eyes closed, listening to this voice instead of your own thoughts, there is a reasonable chance that somewhere in the next few minutes, your body will perform an action so old, so universal, so deeply wired into the nervous system that scientists who have spent entire careers studying it still cannot fully agree on what it is for. You already know what this is. You have done it today. You will probably do it again before this sentence finishes playing in your mind, because simply hearing about it, thinking about it, being invited to notice it, is often enough to trigger it. That's part of what makes it so strange. Yawning doesn't wait for you to be tired. It doesn't only show up at the end of a long day or in the middle of a boring meeting. It arrives uninvited, sometimes at the strangest moments, sometimes in rapid little chains, one after another, as though your body has started a conversation with itself that you were not meant to overhear. Think about the last time you noticed yourself yawning. Maybe it was early this morning, stretching in bed, the yawn arriving alongside the stretch, like two old friends who always show up together. Maybe it was during a long car ride, the hum of the engine and the flat gray highway pulling the yawns out of you one by one. Maybe it happened while you were reading something dense and technical, your eyes sliding across the same sentence twice, and suddenly your jaw dropped open on its own, your eyes watered, and for 2 or 3 seconds the entire world softened at the edges. That soft blur, that brief interruption in your usual alertness, is one of the most common physical experiences a human being can have. And yet it remains, even now, only partly explained. This might seem surprising. We live in an age where scientists can sequence a genome, track a single neuron firing in a living brain, and predict the weather 5 days out with real accuracy. Given all of that, it seems like understanding why we open our mouths and inhale deeply every so often should be simple. But the honest answer, the one careful researchers give when pressed, is that yawning sits at an unusual intersection of physiology, neuroscience, and social behavior, and each of those fields has offered a different partial explanation, none of which quite covers the whole picture on its own. Consider for a moment just how many different situations trigger it. You yawn when you are sleepy, which makes intuitive sense, but you also yawn when you first wake up, before you've had a chance to become tired again, which is a little more puzzling. You yawn when you're bored, staring at a slow clock in a waiting room. You yawn when you're anxious, which surprises most people the first time they notice it. Athletes yawn in the minutes before a competition, not because they are drowsy, but because their bodies are keyed up, adrenaline already moving through them. Musicians report yawning backstage before a performance. Paratroopers have described yawning in the moments before jumping out of a plane. None of these are drowsy moments. They are alert moments, even urgent ones. So whatever yawning is doing, it clearly isn't only about winding down for sleep. Then there's the matter of contagion, which is perhaps the strangest piece of the whole puzzle. Someone near you yawns, and without meaning to, you yawn too. It doesn't require sound. It doesn't even require sight, exactly, since some studies have found that simply reading a detailed description of yawning, the way this narration is doing to you right now, can be enough to trigger the reflex in a portion of listeners. It's contagious, the way certain simple, low-level behaviors are contagious, and researchers have spent real effort trying to determine whether this kind of imitation has anything to do with empathy, with social bonding,
with the same neural circuitry that lets us unconsciously mirror a friend's posture or a stranger's tone of voice. Some evidence supports that connection. Other evidence complicates it. Very young children, for instance, don't reliably catch yawns from the people around them the way adults do, and some researchers have wondered whether that has to do with an aspect of social development that isn't fully formed yet, though this remains an area of open investigation rather than settled fact. There's an old piece of folk wisdom that says yawning is your body's way of getting rid of too much carbon dioxide and pulling in more oxygen, a kind of emergency ventilation system for the blood. It's a tidy explanation, and for a long time, it was the leading assumption, taught in classrooms and repeated in casual conversation, as though it had been proven beyond doubt. But when researchers actually tested it directly, having people breathe air with different oxygen and carbon dioxide levels, and then measuring how often they yawned, the results didn't line up cleanly with the theory. People who were given extra oxygen didn't yawn less. People given air low in oxygen didn't reliably yawn more, at least not in the way the old explanation would predict. The tidy story turned out to be more complicated than it first appeared, which is often how it goes when you look closely enough at something that seems obvious. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it says something about how human knowledge actually works, especially knowledge about our own bodies. We are so used to the sensation of yawning, so familiar with its rhythm and its release, that it feels like something that should have been fully explained centuries ago, filed away alongside digestion and blinking as a solved question. But familiarity and understanding are not the same thing. You can know exactly how something feels without knowing exactly why it happens, and yawning is one of the clearest examples of that gap in the entire human body. Historically, people have offered explanations for yawning for thousands of years, long before anyone had the tools to test those explanations properly. Ancient physicians in Greece, working within a medical framework built around the idea of bodily humors, believed that yawning helped expel what they considered corrupted air trapped inside the body, a kind of internal cleansing breath. In parts of the ancient world, yawning was treated with genuine caution, even a little bit of fear, because an open mouth was thought to be a vulnerable moment, a small doorway through which something unwanted might slip in, or the soul itself might slip out. This is part of why, in many cultures across history, and still today, in some households, there's a custom of covering your mouth when you yawn. What began, in some tellings, as a superstitious protective gesture, eventually settled into simple manners, the kind of small social rule most people follow without remembering or ever knowing its older, stranger origin. Modern research has moved well past humors and wandering souls, of course, using brain imaging, controlled experiments, and comparative studies across many different species. And that comparative angle turns out to be one of the more revealing threads in the whole story. Because yawning is not something only humans do. Dogs yawn, cats yawn, snakes yawn, in a slow, unhurried way that looks almost identical to a human yawn, despite the enormous evolutionary distance between a snake and a person. Fish even open their mouths in a wide, held gesture that some researchers classify as a form of yawning. When a behavior shows up across such a wide range of animals, separated by hundreds of millions of years of evolution, it suggests that whatever yawning is doing, it's doing something old, something that mattered enough to be preserved across an enormous stretch of evolutionary time, even as the bodies performing it changed almost beyond recognition. So here is where this particular story stands, at least for now. Yawning is universal. It appears in humans within days of birth, even before birth, showing up on ultrasound scans of developing fetuses, stretching and opening their mouths in the womb. It appears in nearly every corner of the animal kingdom that has been carefully studied. It responds to tiredness, but also to boredom, anxiety, temperature, and the simple act of watching or hearing someone else do it. And despite all of that consistency, despite how easily it can be triggered, and how instantly recognizable it is across cultures and species, there is still no single, fully agreed upon answer for what yawning is actually for. Different researchers lean toward different explanations, and the evidence for each one is real but partial, like several people describing different rooms of the same house without ever having seen the whole floor plan. That uncertainty, rather than being a disappointment, turns out to be an invitation. Because to understand yawning properly, even loosely, it helps to walk slowly through the body itself, starting with the muscles and the breath, and only later moving outward toward the brain, the eyes, and the strange, quiet way one person's open mouth can reach across a room and open someone else's too.
Let's begin then with the muscles and the breath, because a yawn, slowed down and watched carefully, turns out to be a far more elaborate event than its casual, everyday reputation suggests. Most people think of a yawn as something small, a brief interruption, barely worth noticing except as a mild embarrassment in a meeting or a classroom. But if you could take a single yawn and stretch it out across several minutes, the way a nature documentary might slow down a hummingbird's wing beat until it becomes a series of distinct, deliberate motions, you would see something closer to a small, coordinated performance involving dozens of muscles across the face, jaw, throat, chest, and even the eyes. It starts, almost always, with the inhalation, not an ordinary breath, but a long, deep drawing in of air, slower and larger than the breathing that comes before it. Regular breathing, the kind happening right now as you listen to this, tends to move a relatively small amount of air in and out, using a modest portion of lung capacity. A yawn interrupts that pattern by pulling in a much larger volume of air, filling the lungs closer to their full capacity, the way you might take one long breath before submerging underwater, except without any of the urgency. The inhale during a yawn tends to last somewhere between 1 and 2 seconds, which sounds brief when spoken aloud, but is actually quite long in the context of a single breath. This is the body committing to something, drawing the air in fully rather than sipping at it. At the same time as that inhalation begins, the jaw starts to drop open, and it does not stop at the modest opening used for talking or eating. It continues downward and outward, well past the range used in ordinary conversation, sometimes reaching close to the maximum range of motion the jaw joint allows. If you have ever caught yourself yawning in front of a mirror, you may have noticed how strange your own face looks in that moment, almost unrecognizable, the mouth opened into something closer to an oval than the familiar shapes it makes for speech. The jaw muscles, particularly the ones along the sides of the face near the ears, stretch to their fullest length. The temporomandibular joint, the small hinge connecting the lower jaw to the skull just in front of each ear, rotates and slides forward in a way it rarely does during normal use. This is part of why some people report a faint clicking or popping sensation during a particularly wide yawn. The joint is simply being asked to do something it does not do very often. While the jaw is opening, the muscles of the face are pulling and stretching along with it. The muscles around the eyes tighten, which is part of why the eyes often narrow or squeeze shut during a deep yawn.
The muscles of the cheeks and forehead draw taut. Even the muscles at the back of the throat, the soft palate, and the small conical structure hanging down at the back of the mouth called the uvula, lift and stretch as the throat widens to accommodate the incoming air. The tongue often flattens and drops toward the floor of the mouth, and the throat itself, the pharynx, expands outward, briefly becoming a wider passage than it is during normal breathing. Researchers who have studied yawning using imaging techniques have described this widening of the airway as one of the more physically significant parts of the whole event, a real, measurable expansion of the space through which air travels, not just a subjective feeling of openness. All of this builds toward a moment that people who study yawning sometimes call the peak, though it might be more accurate to think of it the way you would think of the top of a breath held just before diving, a brief suspended point where everything is at its fullest extension. The jaw is at its widest. The lungs are close to their fullest. The muscles of the face and throat are at their most stretched. And then, for perhaps half a second to a full second, everything simply holds there. It is a strange kind of pause, not a stillness exactly, because the body is clearly straining toward something, but a brief suspension before the release that follows. If you pay close attention the next time you catch yourself yawning, you may notice that peak moment, that instant where the stretch feels most complete, just before the whole structure begins to loosen and fall back toward its resting position. The release, when it comes, tends to be quicker than the buildup. The exhalation is often shorter and more abrupt than the long, drawn-in breath that started the yawn, sometimes accompanied by a soft sound, a sigh, or a low groan, produced as air passes back out over the loosened structures of the throat. The jaw begins to close, though not always smoothly. Sometimes it closes in one steady motion. Other times it seems to stutter slightly, as though the muscles are unsure whether they are entirely finished. The muscles of the face relax in something close to reverse order from how they tightened, the tension draining out of the cheeks and forehead and around the eyes. Speaking of the eyes, this is often where some of the more noticeable side effects of a yawn appear. Many people find that their eyes water during a deep yawn, sometimes just a slight glassiness, sometimes an actual tear that has to be wiped away. This happens because of the way the muscles around the eyes are involved in the whole stretching event. As those muscles contract, they can put gentle pressure on the small glands and ducts responsible for tear production and drainage, in much the same way that squeezing a soft object can cause whatever liquid is inside to be pushed outward. The eyes are not crying in any emotional sense during a yawn. It is closer to a mechanical byproduct of the surrounding muscles doing something unusual and forceful. The same way pressing firmly on certain parts of the face can sometimes cause a similar watering effect even without a yawn involved at all. There is also, for many people, a noticeable change in ear pressure during a big yawn, a faint popping or fullness that can feel almost identical to what happens when a plane is descending and the cabin pressure shifts. This happens because the throat and the back of the nasal passages are connected to the middle ear by a small channel called the eustachian tube, which normally stays closed but can open briefly during actions like swallowing, chewing, or yawning. When the muscles around the throat stretch and shift during a yawn, that tube can pop open for a moment, allowing air to move between the throat and the middle ear space, and equalizing pressure on either side of the eardrum. This is why yawning on purpose is sometimes suggested as a way to relieve ear pressure during air travel. though it does not work equally well for everyone. And the sensation itself, that soft internal pop, is simply the physical evidence of that small tube doing its ordinary job in an unusually forceful moment. Perhaps the strangest part of the entire sequence, though, is how difficult it is to stop once it has begun. Most physical actions in the body can be interrupted midway without much trouble. You can stop chewing partway through, stop reaching for something, stop turning your head. But a yawn, once it passes a certain early point, seems to resist interruption in a way that feels almost involuntary, as though the body has committed to finishing what it started. Try, sometime, to stop a yawn once your jaw has begun to drop and your breath has begun to pull inward. It can be done, but it often feels effortful and unsatisfying, like slamming a door that wanted to swing open the rest of the way. Some people describe an almost itchy or unfinished feeling in the jaw or chest if a yawn is cut short, a kind of physical residue left behind, as though the body still wanted to complete the motion and was denied the chance. This resistance to interruption is part of what makes yawning feel different from other reflexes. A cough can often be swallowed. A sneeze can sometimes be suppressed, though not always comfortably. But a yawn, once it crosses that early threshold from urge into motion, tends to insist on completing its full arc, from the deep inhale, through the wide stretch, to the brief peak, and the release that follows. It is a short sequence, usually lasting somewhere between 4 and 7 seconds from beginning to end, but within that small window, an unusual number of systems are working together: the lungs and the jaw, and the muscles of the face and throat, and even the small mechanical structures of the ear, all cooperating in a pattern old enough to be shared with snakes and dogs and fish, and precise enough that scientists can measure its timing down to fractions of a second. And once that whole sequence finishes, once the jaw has closed and the breath has settled, and the eyes have cleared, there is often a brief, quiet aftermath, a kind of settling that is worth pausing on next.
Long before anyone could measure the timing of a yawn down to fractions of a second, people were already trying to explain it, and their explanations tell us as much about how they understood the body as they do about yawning itself. In the medical thinking that dominated much of the ancient and medieval world, the body was imagined as a balance of 4 fluids, or humors, circulating through the system and shaping everything from mood to illness. Blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile were thought to rise and fall in proportion to one another, and health was simply a matter of keeping them in reasonable balance. Yawning, in this framework, was often understood as the body's way of managing air and vapor within that system, a kind of pressure release valve for something building up inside the chest or head. Physicians in ancient Greece, including those working in the tradition associated with Hippocrates, wrote about yawning as connected to the movement of internal vapors, something the body did to expel excess heat or to draw in air that would help cool an overheated internal state. It was not a wild guess. It was a careful attempt to fit a strange, repeating human behavior into the best explanatory system available at the time, one built on the idea that the body was a network of fluids in motion, seeking equilibrium. This humoral idea persisted for a very long time, in part because it was flexible enough to explain almost anything, and in part because there was no real alternative framework to challenge it. If someone yawned when tired, That could be explained as sluggish vapors settling in the body. If someone yawned when bored, that too could be folded into the same story, a kind of stagnant air needing release. The explanation adjusted itself to fit the observation, which made it feel satisfying, even though it was not built on anything that could be tested or measured. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it says something about how difficult yawning has always been to pin down. It is a behavior that shows up in so many different circumstances: tiredness, boredom, hunger, stress, the sight of another person yawning, that almost any theory can find a way to accommodate it. That flexibility is part of why it took so long for a more precise picture to emerge. Alongside the medical theories, ordinary people developed their own explanations, and these folk beliefs traveled widely and lasted, in some communities, well into the 20th century. One of the most persistent was the idea that yawning, without covering the mouth, left a person vulnerable, that the open mouth created a kind of doorway through which something unwanted, whether it was called a spirit, an evil influence, or simply bad luck, could enter the body. This belief appears in slightly different forms across many cultures. In parts of Europe, older generations passed down the custom of making a small sign of the cross near the mouth after yawning, or murmuring a brief phrase, almost like a small verbal door closing behind the physical one. In other traditions, the covering of the mouth during a yawn was framed less as protection from something entering and more as a matter of manners, a way of containing what might be leaving the body, since breath itself was sometimes thought to carry something of a person's inner life or vital essence. Either way, the underlying intuition was the same. An open mouth during a yawn felt significant, felt like a moment when the body was unusually exposed, and cultures found different ways to explain why that moment mattered and how to guard against whatever risk it seemed to carry. It is easy, from a distance of a few centuries, to smile at these beliefs as quaint, but there is something worth noticing in how observant they were, even without any scientific grounding. People noticed that yawning tended to cluster in certain situations. They noticed that it seemed contagious, that one yawn in a room could summon others, and they built stories to explain that pattern long before anyone had a name for social contagion or mirror responses in the brain. They noticed that yawning seemed to increase in moments of transition, at the edges of sleep, in the stretch of a long afternoon, in gatherings where energy was low, and they wove those observations into beliefs about spirits and vulnerability, because that was the explanatory language available to them. In a sense, the folklore was doing rough, early pattern recognition, arriving at real observations about timing and contagion, even while attaching the wrong causal story to them. The shift toward a more physiological understanding did not happen quickly, and it did not happen all at once. Through the medieval and early modern periods, as anatomical study slowly expanded and physicians began dissecting bodies and mapping structures with more precision, yawning remained something of a curiosity rather than a central subject of study. It was mentioned in passing in medical texts, often alongside sneezing, hiccuping, and other involuntary actions, but it rarely received sustained attention on its own. Part of the difficulty was that yawning did not fit neatly into the disease-based framework that dominated much of early medicine. It was not an illness. It did not seem to signal anything urgently wrong with the body. It was simply there, a background behavior, easy to notice and hard to justify studying in depth when there were fevers and wounds and childbirth and infection, demanding a physician's attention. It was not until physiology matured as its own discipline, particularly through the 18th and 19th centuries,
that yawning started to receive more careful, systematic attention. Researchers working during this period were increasingly interested in the mechanics of breathing, in how the lungs expanded, how oxygen moved through the blood, and how the nervous system coordinated seemingly automatic actions like breathing and swallowing. Yawning began to be reframed, tentatively, as connected to respiration, an idea that made intuitive sense given the deep, exaggerated inhale at the center of every yawn. Some physiologists proposed that yawning served to ventilate the lungs more fully than ordinary breathing did, clearing out stale air from the lower portions of the lungs that regular shallow breaths might not reach. This idea had a kind of mechanical elegance to it, and it persisted in various forms for a long time, showing up in textbooks well into the 20th century as a fairly confident explanation, even though later researchers would find real problems with it once they had better tools for measuring what yawning actually does to oxygen and carbon dioxide levels in the blood. This is one of the more instructive threads running through the history of yawning research, the way explanations that felt mechanically sound and intuitively satisfying could be accepted for decades before anyone tested them rigorously.
The ventilation idea was reasonable. It fit what a yawn looks like from the outside: a long pull of air, a wide stretch, something that certainly resembles the body trying to get a bigger breath than usual. But resembling an explanation and being one are different things, and it would take the development of more precise measurement tools, ways of tracking blood oxygen and carbon dioxide with real accuracy, before researchers could actually check whether yawning changed those levels in the way the ventilation theory predicted. That checking, when it eventually happened, produced results messier and more ambiguous than the tidy old story suggested, and it opened the door to newer, competing explanations that are still being tested and argued over today. What stands out, looking back across this long arc, from humoral vapor theories to folk beliefs about open mouths and vulnerable spirits to early physiological guesses about lung ventilation, is how consistently people mistook a plausible story for a settled answer. Each era's explanation felt complete within its own framework. Each one drew on the best available tools and ideas of its time, and each one eventually gave way, not because it was foolish, but because better instruments and more careful observation kept revealing that yawning was more complicated than any single tidy story could hold. That pattern of confident explanation followed by humbling correction turns out to be a fitting introduction to what modern measurement would eventually uncover once scientists could finally watch the body closely enough to see what a yawn is actually doing while it happens. So let's follow that closer watching, because it happened in stages, and each stage chipped away a little more at the ventilation idea until there wasn't much left standing. The most direct way to test whether yawning is about oxygen and carbon dioxide is almost embarrassingly simple, at least in concept. You take people, you change the air they're breathing, and you count their yawns. If yawning exists to fix a gas imbalance in the blood, then giving someone extra oxygen should mean their body has less reason to yawn, since the supposed problem is already solved before it starts. And if you make someone breathe air with more carbon dioxide mixed into it, forcing their system to work harder to clear it, that should trigger yawning like crazy, or at least noticeably more of it, since now there's a real gas imbalance to correct. This is more or less what a researcher named Robert Provine tried in the late 1980s, working with a colleague named Bethel Hammernick and later others, in a study that has become one of the most quoted experiments in the small and slightly eccentric field of yawning research. They sat volunteers down and had them breathe through different gas mixtures for extended stretches of time, sometimes ordinary room air, sometimes air enriched with extra oxygen, sometimes air with elevated carbon dioxide levels, the kind of atmosphere that makes your own breathing feel effortful and a little strange, like trying to read in a room that's slowly running out of fresh air. Then, they simply watched and counted. How many yawns per session? Did the number go up or down depending on what the person was breathing? If you had asked almost anyone in the field beforehand what they expected, they probably would have predicted a fairly clean result. More carbon dioxide, more yawning. More oxygen, less yawning. That's the ventilation story doing exactly what a good theory is supposed to do, making a testable prediction. And this is where things get interesting, because that isn't what the data showed. The yawning rates barely budged. The yawning rates barely budged. People breathing air thick with carbon dioxide did not yawn dramatically more than people breathing ordinary air. People given extra oxygen did not yawn dramatically less. The gas composition of what they were inhaling, changed deliberately and substantially, seemed to have strikingly little effect on how often they yawned. For a theory that had felt so mechanically obvious for so long, this was a quiet but serious blow. It's worth sitting with how strange that result is, if you take the old explanation at face value. Imagine believing for decades that yawning was essentially a pressure release valve for excess carbon dioxide, the way a kettle whistles when steam builds up inside it, and then discovering that you could crank up the carbon dioxide directly, put it right there in the lungs where the body would supposedly detect it and react, and the whistle barely changed pitch. That's not a small crack in a theory. That's closer to finding out the kettle keeps whistling at the same rate, whether it's full of boiling water or barely warm. Other researchers approached the same basic question from different angles, and mostly reached compatible conclusions, though the picture that emerged was never quite as clean as a single dramatic study might suggest. Some looked at exercise, since physical exertion is one of the most reliable ways to genuinely shift a person's blood gas levels, oxygen dropping somewhat, carbon dioxide rising, as muscles burn more fuel and produce more waste gas than they do at rest. If the ventilation theory were right, you'd expect yawning to track with this, increasing as exertion increases and blood gases shift further from their resting baseline. But that's not the pattern researchers found. Yawning doesn't reliably climb during hard exercise. If anything, some studies found the opposite tendency. People yawning less while they're working out, not more, even though their blood chemistry is changing in exactly the direction the old theory said should provoke yawning. There's also the matter of altitude, which offers something like a natural experiment on this question, since climbing to higher elevations means breathing air with genuinely less oxygen in it, not a laboratory approximation, but the real thing, the kind of thinning air that leaves people lightheaded and short of breath on a mountain trail. If oxygen shortage in the blood is what triggers yawning, you might expect people at high altitude to yawn more, their bodies straining against a real and sustained oxygen deficit. This hasn't turned out to be a reliable pattern either. People adapting to low oxygen environments don't show the kind of yawning surge you'd predict if a shortage of oxygen were the direct trigger. And then there's a detail that on its own might be the single strongest piece of evidence against the old theory, something that seems almost too tidy to be true, but has been observed and reported by multiple people working in this area. Researchers have looked at what happens with a particular group of patients, people born with a rare condition
affecting how their brain connects to certain facial muscles, who are physically unable to yawn in the ordinary way. Their mouths don't open into that full, wide stretch the rest of us produce without thinking. And critically, these patients don't seem to suffer for it in any measurable way related to oxygen or carbon dioxide. Their blood gas levels regulate normally. They don't show signs of chronic carbon dioxide buildup or oxygen deprivation. Whatever yawning is doing for the rest of us, these patients appear to be managing their basic gas exchange just fine without it, which is a hard thing to explain if yawning's whole purpose is supposed to be regulating those very gases. Taken together, this body of work, the gas mixture experiments, the exercise studies, the altitude observations, the natural experiment provided by people who can't yawn, built up into something researchers in the field now treat as close to a settled negative. Not settled in the sense that every question about yawning and breathing has been answered, but settled in the narrower sense that the specific, tidy old story, the one where yawning exists mainly to correct a shortage of oxygen or a surplus of carbon dioxide in the blood, doesn't hold up against direct testing. It's a good example of how science sometimes makes its clearest progress not by proving something new, but by carefully, patiently disproving something old, clearing away an explanation that had outlived the evidence supporting it. That leaves an open question, though, and it's worth being honest about how open it still is. If yawning isn't primarily about managing blood gases, what is it about? This is where things get more speculative, and where anyone being careful about the science has to resist the temptation to just swap one confident-sounding story for another.
There are candidate explanations that have gathered real support, ideas connecting yawning to brain temperature regulation, to shifts in arousal and alertness, to transitions between different states like drowsiness and wakefulness, and to something more social, a signal passed between members of a group, related to why yawns spread so easily from one person to another in a room. Some of these ideas have decent experimental backing behind them. None of them has been established with the kind of clean, repeatable evidence that would let anyone call the matter closed. What makes this moment in the story worth sitting with, rather than rushing past toward whatever comes next, is what it reveals about the shape of scientific understanding itself, especially for something as small and universal as a yawn. It would be satisfying to say that once researchers ruled out the oxygen theory, they quickly identified the true answer, and everyone settled into agreement. That's not how it went, and it's not usually how these things go. Ruling something out is often the easier part. What replaces it tends to arrive slowly, through pieces of evidence that fit together imperfectly, competing for explanatory territory, sometimes complementing each other, and sometimes contradicting each other in ways nobody has fully resolved. So the honest place to leave this thread, at least for now, is with the ventilation theory, set gently aside, not because it was a foolish idea, it was reasonable and worth testing, but because testing it thoroughly showed it wasn't the answer. And with that space cleared, there's room to look at what actually does seem to change around the moments when people yawn, starting with something that has nothing to do with the lungs at all, and everything to do with what's happening just above them, inside the skull, where a different kind of regulation might be quietly at work. Think, for a moment, about the last time you noticed yourself yawning. Chances are it wasn't in the middle of some absorbing task, hands full, mind fully occupied. It was probably at an edge of something, waiting for a meeting to start, riding in a car during the flat, featureless stretch of a long highway, lying in bed, not quite asleep, not quite awake either, sitting through the last 20 minutes of a lecture that had already made its point 10 minutes earlier. These moments share a quality that's worth naming carefully, because it turns out to matter more than it first appears. They are transitions. Not activities in themselves, but the spaces between one state and another, the hinge points where the body and brain are shifting gears, even if nothing dramatic is happening on the surface. This is one of the more durable observations in yawning research, and it predates most of the fancier theories about brain temperature or arousal chemistry. Long before anyone had the tools to look at blood flow in the hypothalamus, people had already noticed, informally and then more systematically, that yawning clusters around certain kinds of moments. Waking up, getting ready for sleep, sitting through boredom, feeling nervous before something important, watching activity slow down or speed up. What ties these together isn't any single physical sensation, it's change, or more precisely, it's the nervous system doing the work of shifting from one mode of operating to another. Here, it helps to think about the brain not as a single dial that goes from sleepy to alert and back, but as something closer to a set of overlapping systems, each with its own rhythm, that mostly stay loosely coordinated with each other. There's a system involved in general wakefulness, keeping you responsive to the world. There's a system tied to the sleep-wake cycle on a roughly 24-hour schedule. There's a system tied to short-term vigilance, the kind that spikes when something surprising happens and fades when nothing does. Most of the time, these systems drift along together well enough that you don't notice the seams, but at certain points, especially points of transition, they have to renegotiate their relationship to each other, and some researchers have wondered whether yawning is connected to that renegotiation. Not to any one system directly, not simply to tiredness or simply to boredom, but to the coordination problem of shifting between broader states. This is a more careful way of putting something people already sense intuitively, that yawning has to do with tiredness and yawning has to do with boredom. Both are true as observations. Neither one, on its own, tells the whole story, and it's worth sitting with why. Take tiredness first, since it's the association everyone already carries around. Yawning shows up reliably around sleep onset and around waking. Most people yawn more in the hour before bed, and many people yawn in the minutes after waking, sometimes before they've even opened their eyes all the way. If yawning were simply a symptom of being sleepy, you'd expect it to track sleepiness in a fairly straightforward way. More yawns the sleepier you get, fewer as you become more rested. And there is some relationship along those lines, but the picture gets messier the closer you look. Yawning frequently increases right around the moment of waking, at a point when, by definition, sleep pressure is about to start relaxing rather than building. That's an odd detail if yawning is purely a marker of accumulated sleepiness. It fits more naturally with the idea that yawning has something to do with the process of shifting state, sleep to wake, rather than with the raw quantity of tiredness itself. Boredom tells a similar story from a different angle. It's easy to conflate boredom and drowsiness because they often travel together. A dull task in a warm room in the middle of the afternoon can produce both at once, and it's tempting to treat the yawning in that moment as simply a symptom of a sleepy brain that would rather be napping. But controlled studies going back decades have looked at boredom specifically, using tasks designed to be monotonous without necessarily being sleep-inducing, and yawning still climbs. Watching a static image for an extended period, for instance, or performing a repetitive task that requires just enough attention to prevent actual drowsiness,
still tends to produce more yawning than an engaging alternative, even when people report feeling alert rather than sleepy.
That's a meaningful distinction. It suggests that whatever boredom is doing to the brain, and psychologists still argue about the best way to define boredom precisely, it's producing something that overlaps with the sleep-related yawning pattern without being identical to it. One way researchers have tried to make sense of this overlap is by proposing that boredom and drowsiness might both represent a kind of dip in cortical arousal, a lowering of the general level of engaged, responsive activity in the brain, even though the causes are different. Sleepiness lowers arousal because the sleep-regulating systems are pushing toward rest. Boredom lowers arousal because there isn't enough novelty or stimulation in the environment to keep engagement high. Different mechanisms, different causes, but a similar end state in terms of how alert and responsive the brain's monitoring systems currently are. If yawning is connected to arousal transitions rather than to sleep or boredom specifically, that would explain why it shows up in both contexts without requiring either one to be the real cause of the other. Stress complicates the picture further, and at first glance, it seems like it shouldn't belong in this conversation at all. Stress is usually associated with heightened arousal, not lowered arousal, the opposite direction from drowsiness and boredom. And yet yawning reliably shows up around moments of anticipation and nervous tension. Parachute instructors have long noted, somewhat informally, that first-time jumpers often yawn in the minutes before a jump, not because they're tired or bored in that moment, but because they are, if anything, intensely alert, keyed up, waiting. Musicians and public speakers sometimes describe a similar pattern backstage, an unwelcome urge to yawn arriving in the last minutes before walking out, at precisely the moment they'd expect themselves to feel most awake. Athletes, too, in the tense stretch before a competition begins, sometimes report yawning, despite having no interest in sleep whatsoever. At first, this looks like it might undercut the arousal transition idea, since stress is pushing arousal up rather than down, but some researchers have suggested it actually reinforces the pattern, just from the other direction. If yawning is tied not to any particular level of arousal, but to the process of arousal changing, shifting rapidly from one state to another, then it would make sense to see it both when arousal is dropping, drowsiness settling in, and when arousal is rising sharply, the tense anticipation before a demanding moment. In both cases, the nervous system is in the middle of recalibrating itself, adjusting its baseline to match new demands. The direction of the shift might matter less than the fact that a shift is happening at all. This is still, it's worth saying plainly, an area where the evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive. Nobody has produced a clean, universally accepted account of exactly what arousal transition means at the level of neurons and circuits, or precisely how yawning would participate in it if the idea holds up. But the pattern itself, the clustering of yawns around waking, around sleep onset, around boredom, and around anticipatory stress, is well documented across many independent studies, using different methods and different populations, which gives it more weight than a single clever theory usually carries on its own. Something about these moments keeps drawing yawns out of people, across contexts that otherwise look nothing alike. And this is where the trail leads somewhere unexpected, back toward the brain itself, not toward the lungs or the blood, but toward a question about temperature. Because among the various explanations competing for this territory, one has gathered a particular kind of attention, not because it's proven, but because it offers a physical mechanism specific enough to test directly, involving the temperature of brain tissue itself, and whether a yawn might function as a small, almost mechanical act of cooling,
time to exactly the transitional moments this section has been circling around.
Let's sit with that idea for a while, because it deserves some unhurried attention. The brain cooling hypothesis, as researchers have come to call it, starts from a fairly simple observation about how the brain behaves like any other dense, active piece of tissue. It generates heat as a byproduct of its own operation, constantly, the same way a laptop grows warm on your legs after an hour of use, or the way a car engine radiates heat outward even when it's simply idling in the driveway. The brain is metabolically expensive tissue, burning through a disproportionate share of the body's energy, given its modest size, and all that chemical activity, all those synapses firing and neurotransmitters cycling, produces warmth as a matter of course. Under most circumstances, the body manages this heat quietly, without any conscious awareness on our part, through blood flow that carries warmth away, and through a kind of passive equilibrium with the rest of the body's temperature-regulating systems. But the hypothesis suggests that sometimes, at certain moments, this ordinary cooling isn't quite enough, and something more is needed. A small course correction, and that a yawn might be exactly that. Think about how you might cool down a room that's grown a little too warm, not dangerously warm, just slightly uncomfortable, in a way that makes you restless. You don't necessarily crank up an air conditioner or open every window in the house. Sometimes you just open one window partway, let in a current of cooler air, and give the room a chance to exchange some of its stale warmth for something fresher. The brain cooling hypothesis proposes something structurally similar happening on a much smaller scale inside the skull. A yawn, in this account, isn't primarily about oxygen at all, despite how persistently that explanation lingers in casual conversation. It's about airflow, and specifically about the kind of airflow that might help regulate the temperature of blood moving through the brain. Here's roughly how the mechanism is thought to work, at least according to the researchers who've developed this idea most carefully. When you yawn, your jaw stretches wide, and your breath moves in an unusually deep, prolonged way compared to ordinary breathing, drawing air across a large surface area inside the mouth, throat, and especially the nasal passages. The nasal cavity, as it happens, is lined with a rich network of blood vessels sitting close to the surface, which is part of why your nose can turn cold so quickly on a winter walk, and part of why nosebleeds, when they happen, tend to bleed so visibly. That density of blood vessels close to the surface makes the nasal passages a fairly efficient site for heat exchange, a place where blood can lose warmth to the air passing over it, the same basic physics that lets a radiator cool an engine by exposing hot fluid to moving air across a wide metal surface. Blood that has been cooled slightly in the nasal passages, according to this hypothesis, then continues its circulation, some of it looping back toward the brain, carrying with it a modestly lower temperature than before. It's not a dramatic drop by any means, nothing you'd notice on a thermometer without very precise instruments, but the idea is that even a small shift matters, especially at the specific moments when the brain is undergoing some kind of transition and its thermal regulation might be slightly out of step with what the moment demands. A degree, or even a fraction of a degree, in a system as finely tuned as the brain might be enough to nudge alertness, or to help settle a system that's been running a little too hot for the demands being placed on it. There's a second piece to this mechanism worth mentioning, which involves the physical stretching that happens during a yawn, not just of the jaw, but of the muscles around the face and upper neck. Stretching, in general, tends to increase blood flow to the area being stretched, a fact you may have noticed if you've ever stretched a stiff shoulder or a sore leg and felt a kind of warm looseness
spread through the muscle afterward.
Some researchers have proposed that the stretching component of a yawn works alongside the airflow component, increasing circulation to the head and face at the same moment that cooler air is being drawn in, so that the two effects reinforce each other rather than operating independently. More blood moving through a region that's simultaneously being cooled by nasal airflow could, in principle, produce a more noticeable thermal effect than either mechanism working alone. What makes this hypothesis more than just an appealing story is that it generates predictions specific enough to test in the laboratory, which is a meaningful distinction from some of the other theories this narration has already walked through. If yawning really does help regulate brain temperature, then you'd expect ambient temperature itself to influence how often people yawn, and researchers have in fact gone looking for exactly that relationship. One study, conducted by a psychologist who spent years investigating this question, brought people outside in different seasons and in different weather conditions, and simply counted how often they yawned when shown a series of yawning videos, a method used elsewhere in this narration to study contagious yawning. What emerged was a curve rather than a straight line. On very cold days, people yawned less. On mild, comfortable days, yawning increased. And then, intriguingly, on very hot days, yawning dropped again, almost as if the body had decided that yawning wasn't worth attempting under conditions where it couldn't accomplish much. That inverted U-shape turns out to make a certain intuitive sense if you think about what a yawn would actually be trying to do thermally. On a bitterly cold day, the air is already so much cooler than body temperature that a yawn's cooling effect becomes almost redundant, since the whole body is already losing heat rapidly to the surrounding air without any help. On a very hot day, the opposite problem arises, and a more troubling one. If the air being drawn into the nasal passages is itself hotter than the blood moving past it, then the physics that made cooling possible in the first place simply reverses, and a yawn on a scorching day might do nothing useful at all, or might even work against its own apparent purpose. It's only in that middle range of temperatures, mild enough for incoming air to be cooler than blood, but not so cold that the body is already shedding heat on its own, that yawning would be expected to have the biggest thermal payoff. And that is roughly the pattern the researchers' data showed, an unexpected consistency between a physiological theory and something as ordinary and overlooked as everyday weather. It's worth pausing here to sit with that finding for a moment. In the gentle, unhurried way this narration tends to move, because there's something quietly satisfying about a theory that predicts not just whether something happens, but how much, under which specific conditions, and finds that prediction reasonably well matched in the real world. It's the kind of evidence that separates a hypothesis with some genuine physiological teeth from a purely speculative idea dressed up in scientific language. But satisfying as that finding is, it would be a mistake to treat the brain-cooling hypothesis as settled science, and the more careful researchers working in this area are generally quick to say so themselves. Other studies attempting to replicate or extend the ambient temperature findings have produced more mixed results, some supporting the general pattern and others failing to find it clearly, or finding it only under narrower conditions than the original research suggested. Measuring brain temperature directly and non-invasively in living, awake humans remains genuinely difficult, which means much of the evidence for this hypothesis is necessarily indirect, built from behavioral patterns and ambient conditions rather than from a thermometer placed inside anyone's skull. And there's the deeper, harder question of scale, of whether the tiny temperature shifts a yawn could plausibly produce are large enough to matter functionally, to actually change how alert or drowsy a person feels, rather than being a real,
but essentially negligible physiological ripple, present but too small to do the work the hypothesis assigns to it. Some researchers, in fact, have raised exactly this objection, arguing that even if yawning does produce a measurable cooling effect in the nasal passages and the blood passing through them, that effect may simply be too modest, too fleeting, to meaningfully influence something as complex and densely regulated as brain temperature overall. Others have countered that biological systems often work through small, cumulative, precisely timed adjustments rather than dramatic interventions, and that dismissing a mechanism because its individual effect looks small may be underestimating how such small effects can matter when they occur at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place. This disagreement hasn't been resolved, and it may not be resolved soon, given how difficult the underlying measurements remain. What's left, for now, is a hypothesis with real explanatory appeal, some genuinely supportive evidence, and enough open questions that it sits, appropriately, in the category of promising rather than proven, a piece of the yawning puzzle that fits better than most, without quite closing the picture on its own.
There's another puzzle in yawning that most people have brushed up against without ever naming it, and it usually happens in ordinary company. Someone across the room opens their mouth in that unmistakable slow stretch, and within a few seconds, sometimes less, you feel the pull starting in your own jaw. You didn't decide to yawn. You may not have even wanted to. It arrived the way a shiver arrives in cold air, uninvited, automatic, faintly outside your control. This is contagious yawning, and it turns out to be one of the more thoroughly studied behaviors in all of human psychology, precisely because it's so strange to watch happen and so hard to fully explain. The first thing worth settling, gently, is just how many ways a yawn can spread. Seeing someone yawn is the most obvious trigger, and it's the one researchers have studied the most. But it isn't the only one. Hearing a yawn works too. Audio recordings of yawning sounds, played to people sitting alone in a room with no one to watch, reliably produce yawns in a meaningful portion of listeners, which tells us the contagion doesn't depend on vision alone. Reading about yawning does something similar, and this is the detail people tend to find almost unbelievable until it happens to them. Simply encountering the word yawn, or a sentence describing someone yawning, can trigger the same automatic response, jaw loosening, breath deepening, the whole sequence arriving from nothing more than language on a page, or in this case, words spoken softly in the dark. Even imagining a yawn, deliberately picturing the sensation of one without any external cue at all, has been shown in laboratory settings to nudge some people toward yawning themselves. The trigger, in other words, isn't really the yawn itself. It's the concept of a yawn, however that concept happens to arrive through the eyes, the ears, or simply the mind turning the idea over. For a long time, the dominant explanation for all of this leaned heavily on a single word, empathy. The idea, put simply, was that contagious yawning worked something like emotional contagion, the same underlying machinery that makes you wince when you watch someone stub a toe or tear up at a stranger's grief in a film. Early studies seemed to support this. Researchers found that people who scored higher on standard empathy questionnaires were somewhat more likely to catch a yawn than people who scored lower. Close relationships seemed to matter too. Several studies reported that people were more likely to yawn in response to family members and friends than to strangers, and less likely still in response to people from unfamiliar social or cultural groups, a pattern that lined up neatly with the idea
that yawning contagion tracks social closeness, the same way empathy itself tends to run stronger toward people we know and care about. It's a tidy story, and tidy stories are always a little suspicious in a field this young. As more labs tried to reproduce these findings, the picture grew messier. Some later studies did find a relationship between empathy scores and contagious yawning, but weaker than the original research suggested, and others failed to find any reliable relationship at all. A few of the largest and most carefully controlled studies, involving hundreds of participants rather than the smaller samples common in earlier work, found essentially no connection between how empathetic someone reported being and how susceptible they were to catching a yawn. This doesn't mean empathy has nothing to do with it. It means the relationship, if it exists, is almost certainly more complicated and more modest than the first wave of research implied, and that a behavior showing up in a personality questionnaire is a fairly indirect way of capturing something as automatic and involuntary as a yawning reflex.
The social closeness findings have held up somewhat better, though even here the picture has softened with more scrutiny. Some studies do continue to find that people yawn more in response to close others than to strangers, which fits neatly with a broader idea in social psychology, that we tend to synchronize more readily, in posture, in speech rhythm, in small physical mannerisms, with people we're bonded to. But other studies looking at the same question haven't found the effect, or have found it only under particular conditions, like when participants could clearly see a yawner's full face rather than a partial or obscured view. Attention, in fact, has emerged as one of the sturdier and less glamorous explanations sitting underneath all of this. Several experiments have found that how closely someone is paying attention to a yawning stimulus predicts how likely they are to catch it, more reliably in some analyses than empathy does. People who are distracted, looking away, or engaged with something else entirely are less likely to yawn in response, even when a yawn is happening right in front of them. This suggests that at least part of contagious yawning may have less to do with feeling what another person feels and more to do with simple perceptual processing, whether the brain actually registers the triggering cue with enough clarity and enough attention for the mimicry response to fire. That word, mimicry, points toward another layer of explanation, one rooted less in emotion and more in basic motor imitation. Human brains, and the brains of a number of other species, appear to contain neural systems that respond to observed actions almost as if the observer were performing the action themselves, a kind of automatic echo running quietly in the background of perception. This general tendency toward motor mimicry shows up in far more mundane places than yawning. People unconsciously match the crossed arms of a companion, drift toward the same pace of walking, even begin breathing in loose rhythm with someone they're sitting near for long enough. Contagious yawning may simply be one especially visible, especially dramatic example of this broader mimicry tendency, rather than something that requires its own separate, empathy-specific explanation. Under this view, catching a yawn is less like catching someone's sadness and more like catching someone's stride, an automatic bodily echo that doesn't require understanding or caring about the other person's internal state at all. Age adds another wrinkle worth sitting with quietly for a moment. Susceptibility to contagious yawning appears to develop gradually over childhood rather than being present from birth. Very young children show little to no tendency to catch yawns from others, and the response strengthens noticeably somewhere in the preschool years, around the same general period when children are developing other social cognitive abilities, like recognizing that other people have thoughts and feelings distinct from their own. Susceptibility then appears to decline again in older adulthood in some studies, though this pattern is less consistently reported than the childhood increase. Researchers have debated what this developmental arc actually tells us. If contagious yawning depended purely on simple motor mimicry, one might expect it to be present quite early, since basic imitation shows up remarkably young, sometimes within the first hours of life, for very simple facial gestures. Its later emergence has been used by some as evidence favoring a role for social or empathic development after all, and by others as evidence that the relevant maturing system is more about attention and self-other perceptual awareness broadly, without empathy specifically doing the work. Neither camp has managed a decisive win. Autism research has also intersected with this question, sometimes in ways later research complicated. A number of earlier studies reported that autistic individuals showed reduced contagious yawning compared to neurotypical comparison groups, and this was sometimes framed, a little too neatly, as evidence linking yawning contagion directly to empathic or social processing differences. Subsequent research, using larger and more carefully matched samples, has produced a considerably less consistent picture, with some studies replicating a reduced effect and others finding no meaningful difference at all. As with the empathy questionnaire findings, this doesn't erase the original observations so much as it tempers how confidently anyone should draw a straight line from susceptibility to yawns and a particular cognitive or social profile. What all of this leaves us with, at least for now, is a behavior that clearly spreads through sight and sound and language and even bare imagination, but whose underlying cause seems to be less a single mechanism and more a loose bundle of overlapping ones. Automatic mimicry doing some of the work, attention doing more of it than early researchers expected, and social closeness and empathy playing some role, though a smaller and patchier one than the popular explanation once suggested. It's the kind of scientific territory where the honest answer is genuinely still being drawn, which, as it happens, brings us naturally to a related and equally curious question: why some people seem to catch yawns constantly, while others, sitting in the very same room, barely catch them at all. Long before any of this shows up in a nursery or a classroom, it shows up somewhere far quieter and far stranger, inside the womb. Ultrasound studies going back to the 1990s have captured fetuses opening their mouths in slow, wide, unmistakable arcs as early as 11 or 12 weeks of gestation, and by the second trimester, these movements look, on screen, almost indistinguishable from the yawns any of us might produce, lying in bed at the end of a long day. Researchers had to be careful here, because a fetus makes all sorts of mouth movements, swallowing motions, small twitches, practice movements that look like nothing in particular. But a true fetal yawn has a signature to it, a slow stretch of the jaw, held for a beat, then a slower close, and that particular rhythm is what lets scientists distinguish it from the more random facial fidgeting also happening in there. What makes this genuinely puzzling is that nobody has a settled account of what a yawn is doing for an organism that has never breathed air, never experienced the specific kind of tiredness that comes from being awake too long, and has no lungs, yet drawing on anything but amniotic fluid. Some researchers have proposed that fetal yawning is tied to the maturation of brainstem circuits, a kind of rehearsal, the nervous system testing and wiring the very machinery it will later use for breathing, swallowing, and yes, yawning again after birth, for reasons that actually resemble our own. It's a plausible story, and a rather touching one if you sit with it. This idea that a behavior we associate with drowsy evenings might begin as pure neurological practice, performed in the dark, long before there is anything to be tired from. Once a baby is born, yawning doesn't disappear, but its character changes almost immediately, because now there is air to breathe, and a whole new set of physiological demands to meet. Newborns yawn frequently, often stretching their limbs at the same time in a full-body gesture that looks, to any exhausted new parent watching at 3 in the morning, almost comically dramatic for such a small creature. This early yawning appears to be doing ordinary physiological work, the same broad category of jobs discussed earlier in this very narration: arousal regulation, oxygen and carbon dioxide balance, transitions between sleep and waking. What it is almost certainly not doing, in the first months of life, is spreading contagiously from one person to another. This is one of the more consistent findings in the developmental literature, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, because it runs against a comfortable intuition. If you've ever yawned in front of a baby and watched, half hoping, for a returned yawn, you were likely watching for something that infant brains simply aren't yet built to produce. Studies using video presentations of yawning faces, shown to infants as young as a few months old, have generally failed to find contagious yawning at these earliest ages, no matter how expressive or how many times the video was replayed. The picture shifts gradually across early childhood, though not in the smooth, steady climb one might expect. Several studies looking at contagious yawning in toddlers and preschoolers have found that susceptibility doesn't appear all at once at some fixed age, the way, say, a first tooth reliably arrives within a fairly narrow window. Instead, researchers have observed real variability, with some children showing clear contagious responses by age 2 or 3, and others not showing a reliable pattern until considerably later, sometimes not until 4, 5, or beyond. One especially interesting line of research looked at children on the autism spectrum alongside typically developing children of similar ages, and found that typically developing children showed a rise in contagious yawning with age that wasn't mirrored in quite the same way among the autistic children studied, a finding that fed into the broader, and as the previous discussion made clear, still contested debate about yawning and social or empathic development. But even setting that particular debate aside, the core developmental fact stands on its own and is worth appreciating simply as a fact. Contagious yawning is not present at birth. It builds in gradually, unevenly, over the first several years of life, on a timeline that looks more like the slow accumulation of a skill than the sudden switching on of a reflex. Why would that be? If yawning itself, the physiological, non-contagious kind, is available from before birth. One reasonable explanation ties back to something already discussed: the idea that catching a yawn may depend less on some dedicated empathy module and more on a young brain's growing capacity to notice, hold in mind, and mentally simulate another person's state at all, a general cognitive maturation rather than a single specialized skill flipping on. A very young toddler is still developing the basic capacity to track another person's face as meaningfully separate from the wallpaper, so to speak, before that face's expressions can start to pull an automatic echo out of the toddler's own body. Under this view, contagious yawning isn't a switch. It's closer to a threshold effect sitting downstream of several other developing abilities: attention, self-other distinction, perhaps some early theory of mind, all needing to mature enough, together, before the contagion can reliably fire, move further along the timeline, and the story of yawning keeps changing shape, though more subtly.
Through school-age childhood and adolescence, contagious yawning becomes a fairly stable, reliable phenomenon, similar in most respects to what's observed in adults, though a handful of studies have suggested it may peak somewhere in later childhood or adolescence and taper slightly with age, an intriguing but not fully settled pattern. What's better documented is what happens at the other end of the lifespan. A number of studies looking at contagious yawning in older adults have found reduced susceptibility compared to younger adults, and for a while this fed a simple, tidy hypothesis that aging naturally erodes the empathic responsiveness thought to underlie yawn contagion in the same broad category as other social cognitive changes sometimes observed with age. A closer look, however, complicated that story considerably. At least one influential study found that when researchers controlled for how much attention older participants were actually paying to the yawning stimulus, tracking eye gaze directly rather than assuming attention was equal across age groups, much of the age-related drop in contagious yawning shrank or disappeared. Older participants in some of these studies simply looked at the yawning face, or the yawning mouth specifically, less than younger participants did, and less looking meant less contagion, in a way that had nothing obviously to do with empathy declining and a great deal to do with where the eyes happened to be pointed. This doesn't fully resolve the aging question. Other studies have found age effects that persist even with attention accounted for, but it's a useful reminder, one that echoes through this whole developmental story, that a behavior can look like it's revealing something deep about social cognition when it may, at least partly, be revealing something much more mundane about where a person's gaze was resting on a given day. Individual differences complicate the picture further, and they show up well before old age enters into it at all. Among adults of any given age, susceptibility to contagious yawning varies enormously from one person to the next. Some people yawning back almost every time they see, hear, or even read about someone else yawning, others rarely if ever doing so, and most people falling somewhere in the wide, unremarkable middle. Twin studies have found a heritable component to this variation, suggesting genes play some role, though far from an exclusive one, in why one sibling might be a reliable yawn catcher and another almost immune. Personality research has looked for links to traits like empathy, as already discussed, and also to things like tiredness, stress, and even the time of day a person is tested, with some evidence that people are more susceptible to contagious yawning when they are themselves sleepier, which fits neatly with the broader idea that yawning contagion may ride, in part, on top of a person's own arousal state, rather than floating free of it. None of these individual differences, though, however consistent or statistically real, translate into anything a single yawn, or even a pattern of yawns, could reliably diagnose about a particular person's inner life, empathy level, or attentiveness on any given day, and researchers in this field tend to be quite careful, in their more sober moments, to say so explicitly.
A person who doesn't catch a yawn in the next room isn't thereby revealed as unempathetic, any more than a person who does catch one is thereby revealed as unusually caring, and it's this very unreliability at the level of any single instance, paired with such striking reliability at the level of large groups and averages, that makes yawning such a stubbornly interesting behavior to study in the first place, and such a fitting one to keep circling back to as this particular bedtime exploration continues. Let the human living room fade for a moment, and picture instead a much older stage, a riverbank, a savanna, an aquarium tank lit faintly blue in a quiet house at night. Yawning, or something that looks enough like yawning to earn the same word, shows up across an enormous range of animals, and one of the more calming things a person can do late at night is to let their mind wander through that range slowly, species by species, noticing how often the same basic gesture, a wide opening of the jaw, gets recruited for entirely different jobs depending on whose body it's happening in. Start with other mammals, since they're the closest cousins and the easiest to recognize. A dog stretched out on a rug will yawn in a way that looks almost embarrassingly familiar, jaw-dropping, eyes sometimes closing, a little shudder running through the shoulders afterward. And dog owners have long noticed, informally, long before any scientist wrote it down, that a yawning dog often seems to be shifting gears somehow, settling from alertness into rest, or sometimes the reverse, rousing itself out of a doze before standing up to investigate a sound. That everyday observation turned out to hold up reasonably well under closer study. Yawning in dogs, as in humans, tends to cluster around these transition points, the doorways between one state of arousal and another, rather than appearing at random moments in the middle of steady, unchanging activity. And dogs offer something else that has fascinated researchers for years. They appear to catch yawns not only from other dogs, but sometimes from the humans they live with. Watching a person yawn and yawning back within moments, a small cross-species echo that some researchers have linked to the unusually close social bond between dogs and people, though, as with so much in this field, the size and reliability of the effect has been debated and shouldn't be treated as fully settled. Move to primates, and the picture gets both more familiar and stranger. Chimpanzees yawn in circumstances that look a great deal like the human ones, already described tiredness, boredom, the stretch before sleep. But chimpanzees have also given researchers some of the clearest evidence for contagious yawning outside of humans. Watching videos of other chimpanzees yawning and yawning back at rates well above chance. Some primate researchers have gone further and used yawning, cautiously, as one small piece of evidence in the broader, contentious question of which animals recognize themselves in mirrors or model the minds of others in any meaningful sense, though a single behavior like this can only ever be one thread in a much larger, more careful argument, never proof on its own. Baboons offer a different angle entirely, because in several baboon species, a wide yawn, jaw stretched open to show off long, sharp canine teeth, functions primarily as a threat display, a warning flashed at a rival or a potential predator, closer in spirit to a wolf baring its teeth than to a sleepy human covering their mouth on a train. It's worth sitting with that difference for a moment, because it's a useful reminder that the same physical shape, a mouth opening wide, doesn't always share the same purpose, even within a group of animals as closely related as primates are to one another. A yawn in one species can be a lullaby cue, and in a cousin species down the evolutionary tree, a warning shot. Elephants complicate the picture further, in a quieter way. Elephants have been observed yawning in captivity, often in clusters around rest periods, and some limited evidence has suggested a contagious element there too, though elephant studies are harder to run at scale, simply because elephants are large, slow breeding, and expensive to house and observe compared to smaller lab animals, so the evidence base remains thinner than researchers would like. Lions offer an easier, more visually familiar case. Anyone who has watched footage of lions lounging through the heat of the day has likely seen the enormous, unhurried yawns that seem to ripple through a pride, one animal after another, in the long stretches between hunts, fitting the same broad pattern of yawning clustering around rest and transition that shows up again and again across mammals generally. Birds add a genuinely different wrinkle, because birds don't have the same kind of flexible, muscular jaw that mammals do, and yet many bird species still perform a recognizable open beak stretch that researchers are willing to call
a yawn, or at least to study under that heading with appropriate caution about the word. In birds, this open beak gesture has sometimes been tied less to sleepiness and more to thermoregulation, a way of dumping excess heat through the moist tissues of the mouth and throat, since birds, lacking sweat glands, rely on other routes to cool down, including rapid open-mouth breathing that looks a little like panting. That's a genuinely different explanation from anything discussed so far in mammals, and it's a helpful reminder that researchers studying yawning across species have to resist the temptation to assume one tidy explanation travels cleanly from one branch of the animal family tree to another. A gesture that helps a human brain cool down slightly, as some researchers have proposed for our own species, might, in a bird, be doing something much more directly thermal and far less tied to brain state or drowsiness at all. Reptiles push the picture further still. Snakes are sometimes seen performing a wide gape that looks strikingly like a yawn, jaw stretched open, held for a moment, then closed again, but in snakes, this gesture is frequently tied to something almost mechanical, repositioning the jaw after swallowing prey far larger than the mouth's resting width would suggest is possible, a kind of anatomical reset rather than anything resembling drowsiness or social signaling. Watching a snake do this, if a person has ever seen it on a nature documentary at some late, half-drowsy hour, can feel oddly unsettling precisely because the shape of the motion is so recognizable, while the underlying reason behind it is so unlike the reasons a human yawns. Other reptiles, including various lizards, have been observed performing wide-mouthed gapes that seem tied more to temperature regulation and to territorial or courtship displays, again echoing the bird pattern of heat management and the baboon pattern of social signaling, rather than clustering neatly around rest and sleep, the way the mammalian examples so often do.
Fish extend the range even further, into territory that starts to test how loosely the word yawn can stretch before it stops meaning much of anything useful. Some fish species perform a wide, sudden opening of the mouth that superficially resembles a yawn, and researchers studying this behavior have proposed a number of possible functions depending on the species involved, including flushing water more forcefully across the gills to improve oxygen uptake, something like a deep breath taken through an entirely different kind of respiratory system than the lungs mammals and birds rely on. In some fish, this gaping also seems tied to low oxygen conditions in the surrounding water, suggesting the behavior might function partly as a response to physiological stress rather than anything resembling drowsiness, boredom, or social contagion. This is a useful point to pause on, gently, because it marks something close to the outer edge of how far the comparison can honestly be pushed. A fish gaping for oxygen in shallow, warm water and a human yawning before bed share almost nothing beyond the visual shape of a mouth opening wide, and treating them as the same behavior simply because they look alike from the outside would be a mistake, one that researchers working across species have tried, with varying success, to avoid. Taken together, this tour across the animal kingdom doesn't resolve into one single, satisfying answer about what yawning is for, and it was never likely to. Instead, it offers something arguably more useful for a mind trying to relax into sleep. A picture of one basic physical shape, a jaw dropping open, being borrowed, again and again, by evolution, for whatever job happened to be useful in a given lineage's particular circumstances, sometimes marking a shift toward rest, sometimes flashing a warning, sometimes cooling an overheated body, sometimes just resetting a jaw after a difficult swallow,
sometimes pulling oxygen across a gill in water, too warm or too still. It's a bit like discovering that the same word, in different languages, scattered across the world, has drifted to mean entirely different things, depending on where it landed, related only by a shared root and a coincidence of sound. And within our own species, having wandered this far afield, it's worth turning back toward home once more, because there's still the question of what happens when yawning goes wrong, or at least when it happens far more than the ordinary rhythms of tiredness and transition would seem to call for.
Let's move inside the skull for a while, since that's really where any honest account of yawning has to live, even if what we find there is less a tidy switchboard and more a loose committee of structures that occasionally agree to act in concert. For a long time, popular writing about yawning liked to talk about a yawn center, as though somewhere in the brain there were a single knot of tissue whose entire job was to trigger this behavior, the way a thermostat triggers a furnace. It's a tidy image, and it's mostly wrong, or at least it's wrong in the way that calling a city's traffic flow the work of one traffic light would be wrong. What research has actually turned up is a scattered network touching the hypothalamus, the brainstem, and a handful of chemical messengers that also do a great deal of other work elsewhere in the body, which means yawning isn't so much switched on by a dedicated command post as it is assembled, on the fly, out of machinery that was mostly built for other purposes. The hypothalamus is a reasonable place to start, since it's a structure with a reputation for being involved in almost everything the body needs to regulate without conscious thought. It's small, tucked deep, and low in the brain, roughly the size of an almond, and it manages temperature, hunger, thirst, and the sleep-wake cycle, among other things. Researchers working with animal models, particularly rats, found decades ago that injecting certain chemicals directly into a specific hypothalamic region called the paraventricular nucleus could trigger yawning fairly reliably, which suggested this area might have a kind of privileged role in initiating the behavior. That's a meaningful finding, but it's worth being careful about what it does and doesn't prove. Showing that stimulating a region produces yawning is not the same as showing that region is the seat of yawning, the way finding that turning one particular dial on a mixing board changes the sound of a song doesn't mean that dial is the only thing responsible for the music. The paraventricular nucleus seems to be an important node, one place where several chemical signals converge and where the output can include a yawn, but it sits inside a larger circuit, not above it. One of the chemicals most consistently tied to that hypothalamic triggering is oxytocin, which tends to get talked about in popular science as the bonding hormone or the cuddle chemical, a shorthand that is catchy but a little misleading, since oxytocin's actual job list is much longer and stranger than that nickname suggests. It plays a role in childbirth, in milk letdown, in certain forms of social attachment, and, it turns out, in yawning, at least in the animal studies where it's been most carefully tested. When researchers introduced oxytocin into the brains of rats, yawning frequency went up. When they blocked oxytocin's receptors, it dropped. That's a fairly clean result as these things go, and it's part of why oxytocin sits near the center of most current biological explanations for the physical mechanics of a yawn. But even here, the story resists becoming simple, because oxytocin doesn't act alone. It appears to work by nudging other systems, including dopamine pathways, and dopamine has its own long history of being connected to yawning, mostly through medication effects
rather than through neat laboratory manipulation. The dopamine connection actually surfaces most clearly, not in petri dishes, but in medicine cabinets and doctors' offices, which is a useful reminder that some of the best evidence about how the brain works comes from watching what happens when its chemistry is deliberately, carefully altered for treatment.
People taking certain medications for Parkinson's disease, particularly dopamine agonists, which mimic dopamine's effects on receptors, sometimes report a noticeable uptick in yawning as a side effect, occasionally enough that it becomes a minor talking point between patient and physician. This has been documented often enough that it's treated as a recognized, if not fully explained, phenomenon in clinical literature. The working idea is that dopamine, acting on particular receptor subtypes, can lower the threshold for a yawn to occur, making the behavior easier to trigger and more frequent, in something like the way turning up the sensitivity on a smoke detector means it responds to a lighter wisp of smoke than it otherwise would. This doesn't mean dopamine causes yawning in any simple, direct sense, since plenty of people with entirely ordinary dopamine levels yawn all the time without any pharmaceutical assistance. It means dopamine appears to be one of several dials that can turn the behavior's likelihood up or down. Acetylcholine belongs in this same loose cluster of chemical suspects, and it brings its own complications, partly because acetylcholine is such a workhorse molecule in the nervous system that tying it to any one specific behavior risks oversimplification. It's central to muscle activation throughout the body, and it plays a significant role in the brainstem circuits that govern arousal, attention, and the shifting states between wakefulness and sleep. Some of the same brainstem regions that use acetylcholine to help regulate those transitions have also been implicated in yawning's motor pattern, meaning the actual physical sequence of jaw opening, deep inhalation, brief pause, and slower exhalation. This is where the idea of a pattern generator becomes useful, borrowed from research on other rhythmic behaviors like walking or breathing. A pattern generator, in this context, isn't a single switch, but a small circuit, often in the brainstem, capable of producing a coordinated, repeatable sequence of muscle movements once it's triggered, a little like a music box that once wound and released, always plays through the same short melody in the same order, regardless of what prompted someone to open the lid in the first place. The brainstem seems to house something like this for yawning, a circuit that can execute the physical performance reliably, even while the upstream decision about when to trigger that circuit is being influenced by hypothalamic signals, hormonal states, and whatever chemical messengers happen to be active at that particular moment. Putting these pieces together, hypothalamus, oxytocin, dopamine, acetylcholine, and a brainstem pattern generator doesn't produce a single clean diagram with one arrow pointing to one outcome. It produces something closer to a loose committee where several members have some influence over the final decision, none of them has complete control, and the exact balance of power seems to shift depending on the species being studied, the specific circumstances, and even the individual animal or person involved. This is honestly a fairly common shape for biological explanations to take once they've been studied long enough, and it's worth sitting with that a moment rather than rushing past it in search of tidier language, because the discomfort of an unfinished answer is often exactly where real understanding tends to live. Popular accounts of the brain often prefer the single-center story because it's easier to hold in mind and easier to explain in a sentence. But the actual nervous system, worked out slowly over more than a century of careful, often frustrating research, rarely organizes itself that neatly. Structures overlap in function. Chemicals do several jobs at once, and behaviors that look simple from the outside, a mouth opening, a breath drawn in, turn out to be assembled from contributions no single part can claim credit for alone. There's also a quieter implication tucked inside all this chemical detail, one that matters for anyone lying in the dark tonight, noticing their own yawns arrive in the last stretch before sleep. If dopamine, oxytocin, and acetylcholine are all woven into the systems that also regulate arousal, attachment, and the sleep-wake cycle more broadly, then a yawn showing up right as the body eases toward rest isn't a coincidence needing a separate explanation. It's closer to what you'd expect from overlapping machinery, doing several related jobs with the same shared parts, the way a single set of gears in an old clock might drive both the hour hand and a small chime, not because someone designed them to be philosophically connected, but because it was mechanically efficient to let one system serve two purposes. With that picture of the machinery a little clearer, it's worth turning next to what happens when this normally quiet, background process starts running louder than usual, showing up far more often than ordinary tiredness would explain. Most people who yawn more than usual in a given week are simply more tired than usual, or more bored, or sitting through a longer meeting, and that's the whole story. But every so often someone notices a pattern that feels different in kind, rather than degree. Not just a few extra yawns, but a kind of relentless, almost mechanical repetition, dozens of yawns in an hour, arriving whether or not the room is stuffy or the hour is late, and that person, understandably, starts to wonder if something else is going on. It's worth walking through this gently, because the honest answer sits somewhere between reassurance and genuine medical nuance, and neither extreme does anyone much good. Excessive yawning, when researchers use that phrase carefully, usually means something noticeably beyond a person's own baseline, sustained over days or weeks, rather than a single sleepy afternoon. And the first, and by far the most common explanation, even for a change that feels dramatic to the person experiencing it, remains simple sleep debt. A few nights of shortened or fragmented sleep can push the yawn reflex into overdrive in a way that feels new and alarming, precisely because most people don't track their own baseline closely enough to notice gradual erosion happening beforehand. The body's drive toward sleep doesn't announce itself as a tidy countdown. It accumulates quietly, the way sediment settles at the bottom of a still pond, and then, one day, the yawning simply seems excessive because the underlying tiredness finally reached a threshold where it couldn't stay quiet anymore. So before reaching for anything more exotic, sleep researchers tend to ask the most unglamorous question first. How has this person actually been sleeping? Not how they feel they've been sleeping, but the real, measured hours, because those two things diverge more often than people expect. Certain medications are the next stop, and this is a genuinely well-documented connection, rather than a folk association. Some antidepressants, particularly within the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor family, are known to produce frequent yawning as a side effect
in a meaningful minority of people who take them, and interestingly, this yawning sometimes arrives disconnected from tiredness entirely, showing up in the middle of an alert, engaged afternoon. Researchers who've studied this suspect it relates back to serotonin's role in the same neurochemical neighborhood as dopamine, the very systems discussed a little earlier as being tangled up in triggering a yawn in the first place, though the precise mechanism isn't settled with total confidence. What is fairly well established is the pattern itself. People starting or adjusting certain medications sometimes report a distinct uptick in yawning that eases as their body adjusts or as a dose is changed, and clinicians who prescribe these medications are generally aware of this and can help sort out whether that's what's happening, which is a much more comfortable path than trying to self-diagnose from a search engine at midnight. Then there's a smaller, more specific category, one worth mentioning with care rather than alarm, involving yawning that shows up as a companion to certain neurological events. Some people who experience migraines report a wave of yawning in the hours before the headache itself arrives, as part of what's sometimes called the prodrome, that early warning stretch when the nervous system seems to be signaling that something is shifting before the more familiar migraine symptoms take hold. Nobody fully understands why yawning would be part of that early signal, though again, the same overlapping neurochemistry keeps surfacing as a likely thread connecting these things, dopamine's fingerprints showing up in migraine research, quite apart from anything to do with yawning specifically. For a person who gets migraines regularly, noticing a cluster of yawns as part of their own personal prodrome pattern can actually become useful information, a kind of early weather report their own nervous system provides, the same way some people notice a particular smell or mood shift before a headache and learn to read it as a signal worth heeding, perhaps by resting or hydrating a little sooner than they otherwise would have.
There's also an association between yawning and a feeling of faintness or lightheadedness that some people notice, particularly in situations involving a sudden drop in blood pressure, the kind that can accompany standing up too quickly or experiencing a vasovagal episode, that uncomfortable wave of dizziness and nausea some people feel in response to pain, the sight of blood, or standing too long in a hot room. Yawning shows up often enough in these moments that some researchers have wondered whether it's connected to the same nervous system branch that governs those blood pressure and heart rate shifts, the vagus nerve being a recurring character in this part of the story, though here again, the science describes a correlation researchers have noticed, rather than a fully mapped mechanism. It's a bit like noticing that a particular bird always seems to appear before a storm. The correlation might be real, and even useful to know, without anyone having fully worked out the meteorology connecting the two. Beyond these more common threads, there is a small set of neurological conditions where excessive yawning has been documented as an occasional feature, including certain seizure disorders, some brainstem conditions, and rare instances following stroke, particularly strokes affecting specific regions involved in the same yawn circuitry discussed earlier. These associations are real and documented in the medical literature, but it's worth being precise about what that actually means, because it's easy for a list like this to sound frightening out of proportion to how common these situations actually are. A symptom appearing as one possible feature among many in a rare condition is a completely different thing from that symptom reliably indicating the condition, the way a cough can appear in dozens of situations from a dusty room to a serious respiratory illness without a cough by itself telling anyone which one they're dealing with. Excessive yawning on its own, without other symptoms accompanying it,
is far more likely to trace back to something ordinary, poor sleep, a medication, simple boredom, than to anything requiring urgent concern. What actually tends to matter, according to people who study and treat these patterns clinically, isn't the yawning in isolation, but the company it keeps. Yawning that arrives alongside other new and unexplained symptoms, sudden weakness on one side of the body, confusion, difficulty speaking, chest pain, or a fainting spell that doesn't have an obvious explanation, is the kind of combination worth bringing to a doctor, not because the yawning itself is dangerous, but because it's traveling with companions that deserve attention, regardless of whether yawning was among them. Yawning that shows up alone, however frequent, especially in someone who can point to recent poor sleep, a new medication, or simply an unusually monotonous week, is far more likely to resolve quietly on its own once the underlying cause does.
This is really just an ordinary piece of medical reasoning applied to an unusual symptom. Context changes the meaning of almost everything the body does. The same cough meaning something different in a smoker than in a small child. The same fatigue meaning something different after a long flight than after a normal week at home. It's worth sitting for a moment with how strange it is that yawning, of all things, this small, almost comic gesture that shows up in cartoons and classrooms and long car rides, turns out to have this many possible threads running through it, from ordinary tiredness all the way to prodrome warnings before a migraine. That range itself says something true about the body, which is that very few of its behaviors belong to just one system with just one job. A yawn can be boredom, or sleep debt, or a side effect, or a passing signal from a nervous system doing something else entirely, and from the outside, watching someone's jaw drop open and their eyes water for a few seconds, there's no way to tell which story is unfolding underneath. And that returns us, gently, to some of the largest and still least settled questions in the whole subject, the ones this exploration keeps circling without quite landing on solid ground. Why the sight of someone else yawning spreads so reliably from person to person, why some individuals seem almost immune to that contagion, while others catch it from a photograph or even a written description, and what, if anything, that difference reveals about the deeper wiring connecting one mind to another when. So let's come back to it one more time, the way you'd come back to a familiar room after walking through a house full of stranger ones. Picture just one yawn, happening nowhere in particular, to nobody in particular. A slow pull opens the jaw. The eyes narrow, maybe water a little. The chest expands, ribs widening the way they do at the top of a long, unhurried breath. And then, a few seconds later, everything releases at once. Jaw, shoulders, chest, in a loose little collapse that feels almost like relief, even when nothing was wrong to begin with. That is the whole event, start to finish, maybe 6 or 8 seconds, and by the time it is over, something measurable has actually changed inside the body that produced it. Blood flow to the brain shifts slightly during that stretch and release, and the sharp inhale pulls in a rush of air that cools blood moving through vessels near the sinuses, which sit close enough to the brain that a small temperature change there might nudge a small temperature change here too. This is the thermoregulation idea again. The thought that a yawn works something like a radiator vent for the skull, cracking open just enough to let a little excess heat escape before the brain runs too warm to work at its best. Nobody has proven this is the entire reason yawning exists, and it's worth staying honest about that uncertainty rather than smoothing it over. But the pattern keeps showing up in study after study, in one form or another. People yawning more in warm rooms than cool ones, yawning less when a cold pack rests against the forehead, yawning more often in the hour before body temperature naturally peaks in its daily rhythm than in the hour after. A small mechanism, doing a small job, mostly invisible, mostly unremarkable, and yet apparently useful enough that evolution kept it around across an enormous stretch of the animal kingdom. Because that's another thread worth holding on to as this all comes together. Yawning is not a peculiarly human habit that showed up recently and spread through culture like a fashion for crossed arms or raised eyebrows. Dogs yawn. Cats yawn, often in that particular slow-motion way that makes the whole body seem to stretch outward from the jaw first. Snakes yawn, not from tiredness, but to reset a jaw that has to unhinge itself for eating something far too large for its own head. Fish yawn, if you're willing to call that gaping mouth motion a yawn, which some researchers are and others aren't. Birds do it. Even some reptiles that spend most of their lives nearly motionless in the sun will occasionally open their mouths in that same unmistakable stretch and release pattern. When a behavior turns up across so many different kinds of nervous systems, built by so many different evolutionary paths, that usually means it is doing something worth doing, something old enough and useful enough that it never got edited out along the way, even if no single explanation captures the whole reason for it in every species that shows it. And it starts early, earlier than almost anything else the body learns to do. An unborn human yawns inside the womb, visible on ultrasound as early as somewhere around the 11th or 12th week, long before that developing brain could possibly be bored, long before there's been a single late night or a single dull lecture to sit through. Whatever yawning is doing at that stage, it isn't responding to tiredness in any way an adult would recognize tiredness. It may be practicing the machinery, exercising a jaw and a set of breathing muscles that will need to work smoothly after birth, laying down neural pathways the way kicking and stretching lay down pathways for muscles and joints that won't be needed for their real purpose for months yet. A yawn before birth is not a small version of an adult yawn with the meaning subtracted out. It might be closer to a rehearsal, a private run-through of a motion the body will spend the rest of its life performing, without ever fully knowing why. Somewhere between that early rehearsal and adulthood, something else gets added on top of the plain physical mechanism, and this is where the contagious side of yawning enters the picture again, the side that turns a private, solitary reflex into something that ripples outward between people. A newborn does not catch a yawn from watching someone else yawn. That particular response seems to develop gradually, showing up more reliably, somewhere around 4 or 5 years old, right around the same stretch of childhood when children are also getting noticeably better at guessing what another person is thinking or feeling from nothing more than a glance at their face. That timing is suggestive, rather than conclusive, one more thread that hasn't been fully tied off, but it lines up with an idea that keeps surfacing throughout this whole subject, that contagious yawning might be quietly bound up with empathy, with the brain's capacity to model another mind well enough to be moved by it, even in this small, almost absurd way, even when the person doing the moving is a stranger on a screen, rather than someone standing in the room. That would help explain why the contagion isn't distributed evenly across a group of people watching the same yawning face. Some people catch it almost every time, jaw loosening within a second or two of seeing someone else's mouth fall open. Others watch the same video, the same slow stretch and release, and feel almost nothing. No tug, no echo, nothing but mild curiosity about why the person on screen looks so sleepy. Studies have found that people who score higher on certain measures of empathy tend, on average, to catch yawns more readily than people who score lower,
and that very young children and people on the autism spectrum sometimes show reduced susceptibility to yawn contagion compared to other groups, though these are patterns showing up across groups in research settings, not rules that hold true for any one individual, and there is real disagreement among researchers about how strong or reliable this empathy connection actually is. Some studies find it, some don't. Some find it only under certain conditions, with certain kinds of stimuli, in certain age groups. That disagreement is worth sitting with honestly rather than resolving it into a tidier story than the evidence supports. And that, in the end, might be the most fitting way to leave this subject, since almost nothing about yawning resolves into a tidy story. It is boredom sometimes, and sleepiness sometimes, and neither of those things at all sometimes, showing up instead as a stray signal from a nervous system busy with some other task entirely. It cools the brain, maybe, a little, some of the time, in a mechanism nobody has fully confirmed. It ripples between members of a species in a way that seems tied to social connection, though the exact wiring behind that ripple is still being mapped out one small, careful study at a time. It shows up in a fetus that has never been tired a single day of its life, and in a lion, mid-yawn on a nature documentary, and in a dog stretched out on a warm floor, and in you, right now, if this description has done its usual quiet work and pulled one loose from wherever it's been waiting. There is something almost comforting in that unfinished quality, in the fact that scientists who have spent entire careers studying yawning still don't have every answer nailed down. It means the body keeps a few of its habits a little bit mysterious, even the small, ordinary ones, even the ones everyone does, several times a day, without ever thinking twice about it. Not everything needs to be fully explained to be safe, or familiar, or worth resting into. A yawn is still, after everything, just a slow opening and a slow release, breath drawn in and let back out, muscles tightening, and then letting go, the body doing what it has done since before it was even born, long before there was anyone awake to notice or wonder why.
So if one is arriving now, there's no need to fight it, no need to explain it, nothing to figure out before it's allowed to happen. Let the jaw loosen, let the breath go long and slow and a little shaky on the way in. Let the shoulders drop, let the eyes fall, let whatever tension has been sitting in the chest or the back of the neck loosen its grip a little further with every slow exhale. The body already knows how to do this part. It doesn't need instructions, and it doesn't need an explanation, only permission, and the simple, unremarkable, endlessly repeated act of letting go. Rest well.